Welcome to the Alchemy of Agile. Today we're going to discuss the science behind Agile and the not-so-magic ingredient that organizations tend to miss when trying to reach true agility: culture. Culture is not something you can copy. You can't just buy foosball tables and Nerf guns. It has to be built. Through this presentation, we'll talk about what that culture looks like and the necessary steps to build it. Before we move any further, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Brad Nelson. My 9-to-5 is an Agile coach for Insight Digital Innovation. As you can see here, I hold many certifications related to my field. However, I wasn't always an Agile coach. I actually was passionate about design when I started out, and I was a front-end developer and designer for a local studio. I then found myself working in a factory for several years, where I was introduced to concepts like Lean and Kanban, and little did I know at the time, those would serve me throughout my career in software development. When I made my return to software development, I was a QA tester, I was a BA, and I was a Scrum Master. And I still actually moonlight as a designer. Our overview today, or our magical elements for this presentation, we have our introduction, which we just went through. Then we're going to talk about the golden circle, go through a brief history of software development, including the manifesto of Agile software development, move into learning culture, safety culture, and touch on how you change culture. I want to talk about the order of this presentation, and it directly ties back to the message, and that's with the process of getting buy-in. Simon Sinek has created a concept known as the golden circle. In it, he explains that people are biologically wired to buy into why you do something, not how or what. It's the reason why Apple is wildly more successful than Dell. Both of them build electronics in specific computers, but Apple is challenging the status quo. They're empowering great people to do great things. Whereas Dell just sells computers. You can do with them whatever you want. The why is super important. Change management teaches that the first step in creating a change is through awareness, and it's oftentimes the area overlooked the most. So in this presentation, I want to start with why we do Agile. And in order to effectively do that, we need to go into a brief history of software development. Ada Lovelace wrote the first algorithm intended for a machine in the 1840s. However, it wasn't another 100 years until the first programming language was created by Conrad Zuse. In the 50s, we had the first commercially available programming language. And then in the 60s, Margaret Hamilton coined the term software engineering, first as a joke while working for NASA on the Apollo project. Prior to this, software engineering and computer science weren't really considered a profession, and definitely not one as prestigious as engineering. In the 70s, Dr. Winston Royce published his famous paper credited with what is now known as the waterfall model. However, it was merely the first publication. The approach had been around for 20 years prior to that. And he did not coin the term waterfall in that paper, but it shortly followed. Enter the 80s, we hit what's known as the software crisis. The problem that developers ran into is that what companies needed them to develop changed very quickly. The needs of the business ebb and flow. Their competitors come out with new things. Their customers want new things. And they were unable to modify their code or create new code fast enough to adhere to those needs. As I mentioned, software development was based off of engineering. And in traditional engineering or civil engineering, like building a bridge, we tend to plan our whole process up front. And then we build out the bridge to completion. And then hopefully we test it. Otherwise, the results could be rather fatal. But the idea of a bridge or a building is that they don't really change structurally throughout their existence. However, software is a different beast altogether, has different problems that I think are best captured by Kent Beck in his book Extreme Programming Explained. Kent Beck says, "The development of a piece of software changes its own requirements. As soon as the customers see the first release, they learn what they want in the second release, or what they really wanted in the first. And it's valuable learning, because it couldn't have possibly taken place based on speculation. It is learning that can only come from experience. But customers can't get there alone. They need people who can program not as guides, but as companions. So professionals in the software development space started asking themselves, how can we go faster? How can we get lighter? How can we become leaner? That's right, Agile is a lean method for software development. And for those unfamiliar with lean, it is a process designed to eliminate waste that really came to light in the automotive industry starting in the early 1900s. Ford first used the ideas to standardize the production of the Model T, a process that previously required a master craftsman. Later, Taiichi Ohno from Toyota combined it with the lessons from Dr. Deming to address their unique constraint, which was a lack of space and demand in a post-World War II Japan. Lean was so successful that it not only made Ford the powerhouse that it is today, but it later allowed Toyota to surpass Ford. One of the ways software developers became more lean was by implementing the scientific method as developed by Francis Bacon in the 17th century, commonly called the Deming Cycle, but really captured by Dr. Shu Hart as PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act. As the visual shows, it's really a feedback loop. The idea is that you plan what you want to accomplish, you do as little as possible to realize that plan, you check to see if the desired effect was seen, and then you act upon those findings. So instead of a 12 to 18 month development cycle, developers would do just enough to add value, and then they would check in with the business or customers to see if they were on the right track. This process allows the team to focus on the things that really do provide value, and by checking in on the things that don't early on, we know to stop building those things. This is the science behind agility. Feedback loops are a pretty common facilitation, but I think they confuse a lot of people. So if we laid out our projects, they would look something like this. In the traditional method, you'll notice that the phases ideally don't overlap at all, instead following a toll gate process that resembles a waterfall, hence the name. There's a sizable plan phase up front, then the developers develop to the plan, and if we have time, we'll test at the end. I'm poking fun at it a little bit, but this is a real thing I've lived, and I'm sure many of you have too. Development takes longer than expected, so we just need to test extra fast, and I'm sure we won't miss anything. Alright, looking at the PDCA, or feedback loop that is used in Agile, you notice that there's actually a lot more planning. In fact, we plan the entire time through. You also notice that testing ideally starts before we even begin developing. You might be asking yourself, how is that possible if there's nothing to test yet? But the reality is that there are assumptions we have made in our initial planning that can be validated. Designs that can be put in front of users, test-driven development where the developer writes a unit test first, then writes the code to pass it, and so on. The testing is much more robust than a test script. Quality is owned by all, like in the case of the developer writing the unit test up front, but we validate what we are working on with real-life users. The results of that testing then feeds back into the planning, and that's why the planning phase extends pretty much the entire duration. Getting back to our timeline, in 1986, the Harvard Business Review published the New Product Development Game by Hirotaka Takeuchi and Ikujiro Nonaka, where they compared the back and forth nature of this new way of doing software development to rugby. This article was the inspiration behind the name Scrum, which later became the most popular framework for Agilists. Speaking of Scrum, the 90s gave rise to various frameworks and practices. You see, this new way of developing was a paradigm shift for most companies. It was a new way of thinking and behaving, and it wasn't easy. These techniques are an effort to deliver value incrementally, which allows us to course correct on the way. However, at this point, the word Agile had yet to be used. 17 software development gurus working in this way already, including the founders of Scrum and XP, got together in 2000 and again in 2001 to share their experiences and talk about how they could grow this new way of doing software development. It was during these meetings that the Manifesto of Agile Software Development was born, and it marked the first time that all of these frameworks shared a common name, and that name was Agile. The main part of the manifesto included 4 fundamental values, and there's also 12 principles that go along with these 4 values, but they really just emphasize the 4 values. These 4 values are individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. I want you to notice that the stuff on the left, they're saying is important over the stuff on the right, but they're not saying the stuff on the right doesn't add value. Just like the previous slide, right? There is value in a plan, but there's more value in responding to change than following a plan. I also want you to notice, if you're familiar with any of the frameworks like Scrum, they don't talk about specific practices or tools that you need to use to be agile. These are all more ways of being or acting. So therefore, agile is a culture. There are plenty of best practices that various professionals and frameworks have utilized for efficient software development, but doing those alone don't make you agile. At the end of the day, agile really is a culture. And according to Uncle Bob, agile is a culture expressed through a set of practices. I would like to take his point a step further and say that agile really is a learning culture. So like pulling a rabbit out of a hat, we're on our way to turning business requirements into gold. Values and principles, that sounds philosophical and great, but is there any science behind it? Well, Google, in Google's typical fashion, did a study called Project Aristotle to try to find the perfect equation for building a high-performing team. Their original hypothesis was that it would depend on how many PhDs were on the team. What they actually found out is that who is on the team matters way less than how the team members interact, the structure of their work, and how they view their contributions. Andrew Clay Schaefer is quoted as saying, "You are either building a learning organization or you'll be losing to someone who is." All right, so what does a learning organization entail? Well, luckily for us, Peter Senge has already defined the 5 principles of a learning organization. Those are personal mastery, mental models, shared vision, team learning, and systems thinking. Personal mastery. After being sufficiently paid, people are motivated by 3 things: autonomy, purpose, and mastery. We need to give people the opportunity to master their craft. It's the reason that people practice the guitar for countless hours, even if they have no intention on playing in a band or making it big. There's different ways that we can promote this as a company, like paid training, giving developers time to work on what they want to work on, or addressing tech debt, letting people move between teams. Even though they're a specialist, might get old, so we should let them move. There's also hackathons that you can do. When I worked at Meyer for a few years, we did hackathons frequently. And one of the things that came out of a hackathon was Scan and Go, which is in some stores today. We didn't have it fully developed, but we had a major portion of the concept and we were able to actually demonstrate it to the business, and it became public-facing software. Mental models. Mental models are deeply ingrained assumptions, ideals, and values. Organizations are most successful when employees can relate to the mental model of the organization. Do we share the same values? Do the employees believe in what the company is trying to accomplish? Goldratt warns about understanding your limitations, and especially your unidentified limitations. 200 years ago, it was not feasible for a person to have a full-time job and cover 10 miles a day. If a person got a job in the next town over, they would move. If you asked the person at that time if it was a limitation, no one would say it was. It was just a way of life. However, I bet most of you drive more than 10 miles to work every day today. It's no longer a limitation. And this is where the danger is. Not only is there a limitation that prevents us from doing something, but is that limitation still relevant? Is it still a limitation? Some people do things because that's how they've always done it, or they make an assumption that there are limitations that do not exist. Another example of a mental model, like the picture here, is a black cat. Black cats are the least adopted cat because people fear they are bad luck. Shared vision. I'm guessing most of you don't have a crystal ball and are incapable of reading minds. If you are, please shoot me an email. I have a great business deal for you. Shared vision is the most important responsibility of leadership. To share a vision from the top down. Peter Senge reminds us that just creating a shared vision isn't enough. It's not an item to possess, but a discipline. The real work is promoting the vision, not creating it. When a person is empowered and has a clear vision and an understanding of the current reality, they will strive to fill the gap between the vision and reality. And when the vision of the organization and its employees align, employees do tasks because they want to, not because they have to. Simon Sinek advises that companies shouldn't hire people and then try to convince them of your vision, You should hire people who share your vision to begin with. Team learning. When colleagues consider themselves team members instead of rivals, they're able to share their personal masteries to effectively work as a team. Think of an orchestra. It's not just a bunch of individual instruments played all at once. Songs aren't a group of super talented people all playing the most complex notes possible. They're playing off each other, oftentimes in a less complex way, to create harmony that resonates in our ears, sometimes moves the soul. I have heard a lot of stories, well, maybe not a lot, multiple stories, of people firing their top talent, their hero developer, and having great success stories. There's typically too much work for one person to ever truly do, and if you have one expert that everyone goes to, that person becomes a bottleneck. Likewise, if your systems are too complicated for anyone else to understand, likely they're needlessly complicated, and even your expert doesn't fully understand it. And let's be fair, we work in complicated systems. They don't need help becoming any more complicated. Well, the story basically goes, this company fired their mad genius and implemented a new strategy around team collaboration. The product they came up with wasn't as big or intricate, but it had almost no bugs and zero downtime. More ways you can contribute to team learning is allowing the team to self-organize, having them do peer reviews of each other's work, or doing something like paired or mob programming. The fifth discipline is system thinking. System thinking is really pulling everything together. It's when you start looking at the system as a whole instead of focusing on the individuals. Just like you are part of a bigger team, your team is a part of a larger organization, and everything we do has a ripple effect. This is about removing the segregation not only of your team, but your department. We need to break down the walls of IT and business because every company today is a digital company. And with that, how we measure ourselves need to align with the business's objectives. The things we do in IT should directly benefit the company, and measuring productivity does not equal increased value to the organization or our customers. So to recap, those are the 5 disciplines of a learning culture: personal mastery, mental models, shared vision, team learning, systems thinking. In order for there to be an effective learning culture, first you need safety culture. Safety doesn't mean showing up to work in a biohazard suit or paying attention to wet floor signs. What we really mean by safety culture is the ability to tell your boss bad news, or psychological safety. We move back a few slides to the Aristotle Project by Google. One of their key findings was the importance of psychological safety with the team. When we're talking about psychological safety, there needs to be a shift from who broke it to what broke it. Part of working in a learning organization is knowing that you don't and won't have all the answers up front. The things we are working on are complex, and knowledge work is abstract. So the best we can do is just start with what we know now and iterate as we grow and learn. The Toyota way, which is almost synonymous with lean at this point, is infamous for their andon cord. It's essentially a pull chain that stops the train, but in this case it stops production. An employee would pull this anytime they were blocked by something wasn't going to plan, or there was a potential improvement. A pull of this cord would stop the entire production line, and the first thing the manager would do is he would thank them for the learning experience. At that point, the entire production line would stop, and everyone would huddle around the problem to fix it as soon as possible, and learn from those improvements. Toyota was so obsessed with improvement that there's a story of a plant that went from 1,000 cord pulls a day down to 800. The plant manager pulled everyone aside, and instead of being grateful that they had realized the 20% improvement in efficiency, he said, "Guys, we have a serious problem here. We have 20% less opportunities to learn." So if we're looking at Agile as a whole, Agile is built on a learning culture that requires the foundation of a safety culture. You need 5 disciplines, and you need psychological safety to have an effective Agile culture. So how do we change culture? I'll admit, change is hard. It can be really hard. That's why there's so many self-help books. It's also why organizations hire organization change consultants or agile coaches like myself. But there's a basic understanding behind all of them that can be found in psychology. A quote from John Shook says, "It's easier to act your way to a new way of thinking than to think your way to a new way of acting." A little bit of wordplay there, but we'll break it down using the cognitive triangle. Behavioral thought therapy teaches that what we think affects how we feel and act. For example, I think that nobody likes me, so therefore I don't go out, which makes me depressed. And since I don't go out, I didn't see anyone, and therefore nobody must like me. In a work setting, we might feel rushed, and therefore we think we have too much to do. So then we only do a quick fix or try to only do the bare minimum to make something work. Therefore it breaks again, or as tech debt we need to address again later. Adding to the amount of work we have to do and reinforcing the thought we have too much to do and ultimately making us feel rushed. Another example, I have the feeling I don't trust IT. Because of the thought, IT never gets anything done. Therefore, we need to get them to start everything earlier. Now my developers aren't just working on finishing one thing, they're working on finishing 10 things, which means they spend 90% less time on each item, plus the context switch deficit. And therefore, they can never get anything done, reinforcing the thought, IT never gets anything done, and ultimately this hurts our feelings of trust. All three of these affect each other. And once we understand this, they are levers we can try to pull in order to realize change. However, it's really difficult to change how people feel. In fact, it's the most difficult. Have you ever tried to will yourself to be happy? The next most difficult is our thoughts, but behavior. Behavior is an easy thing to change. I don't know if any of you watching are a fan of The Karate Kid, but I certainly am. In the movie, the main protagonist, Daniel, begs Mr. Miyagi to teach him karate. After Daniel gets bullied by some kids, Mr. Miyagi finally takes pity on him and agrees to teach him. Daniel is eager to learn, so he anxiously shows up to Mr. Miyagi's house every day. But instead of karate training, he has him doing chores around the house. He had him painting his house and waxing his car. The Ford Deluxe, like in this picture, was with the famous line that if you're not a Karate Kid fan, you've still probably heard, which is wax on, wax off. All this goes on until Daniel finally gets fed up and he's like, "Hey old man, I'm not doing all your chores for you and you're supposed to be teaching me karate." At that point, Mr. Miyagi attacks Daniel and he has the epiphany that the chores he was doing were actually teaching him karate. Like this story of the Karate Kid, we teach the Agile mindset through behaviors, and it may not always be obvious. That is why we are culture defined by practices. That is why we use frameworks like Scrum. If you're doing Scrum today, the different events are meant to teach you different things. They're not just motions. Our daily Scrum teaches us to respond to change. Our reviews teach us the importance of frequent feedback, so on and so forth. So if you're in an Agile environment today, following a framework, I implore you to not just go through the motions. It's important to be mindful of what we do. And I would encourage you to ask why you are doing the things you do. Like we pointed out at the beginning of this presentation, people care about the why. You don't have to be left in the dark like Daniel. So I will leave you with this thought, this question. What thoughts and feelings do your behaviors currently create? So to recap everything we've gone through today, Agile spawned from a need to change and adapt. Therefore, we need to build a culture of learning built on a foundation of safety. But in order to be Agile, we ourselves need to change and adapt. And the most effective way to change is by changing behaviors. However, we have to know why we are changing in the first place. There are so many good books to recommend, but these are the three that relate directly to this presentation. Accelerate is one of my all-time favorite books. It's basically Google's Project Aristotle that we talked about earlier, but across multiple companies. And the second half of the book documents the process used to do the research so you can fact-check the author. The Phoenix Project is a must-read in IT. It takes the lessons from the Toyota Way and the goal and applies them directly to software development. The last one here, The Fifth Discipline by Peter Senge, is notorious for being difficult to read. However, the ideas behind it are fantastic and helped in this presentation. I recently purchased the audiobook on Audible for it, and I don't think it was that bad. I've tried reading the actual book in the past. I think they tweaked it a little bit to make it a little bit better. However, if you are interested in reading the Fifth Discipline, I would recommend the audiobook. That concludes this presentation. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it educational. If you have any questions or you would like to reach out to me, you can add me on LinkedIn. You can scan the QR code on your screen. Otherwise, you can find me at linkedin.com/in/Bradgile. You can email me directly, hello@bradgile.com. I would love to hear from you. There are many resources that went into this presentation. I'm going to scroll through them now. Please feel free to pause. Please feel free to read or fact check me. I encourage you to.